Welcome everyone to our first BAD event in 2022. Welcome, and my name, by the way, is Catherine Dupoulou-Ménager, and I'm the Artistic Director of BAD Sydney. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. I'm speaking to you today from Camaragal land, and Sulari Gentill, who's joining us, will be speaking from another land. I don't know what we can do for you, Abir, but I am more than delighted to welcome you to BAD. Ever since I read Abir Mukherjee's the first in the Wyndham and Banerjee series, I've been trying to find a way of making sure we could talk to you. Can't get you here in person, but at least you're here on screen. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
And you're a bit early as well in London. We appreciate that too. And in a house of COVID, as is your interviewer, Sulari Gentill. So we're very grateful to you both for being here. Sulari is also a writer of historical crime fiction, but in a very different time and a very different place. So I think this should be a great conversation. Before we start the interview, I want to thank our sponsors, the City of Sydney and Create New South Wales. Without them, it would be almost impossible to do this work, particularly in the current climate where you never know when you're going to have to cancel something and you need to respond immediately. We also have a relationship with Booktopia, our online bookseller, and do pop over to their book site and a website and buy a copy of all the books, or to any good bookshop. They should be able to do it as well. I'd like to welcome all members of the BAD community, particularly viewers from public libraries throughout New South Wales. We are really pleased to have you with us. Just going to let you know very quickly how we'll be running the event. Abir and Sulari will talk for about 45 minutes. Sulari will remind you to send questions through Q&A a bit before that time or around that time, and then she'll ask the questions on your behalf. I'll disappear shortly and then I'll come back at the end to say thank you. So now to tonight's interview. Abir Mukherjee's latest book, The Shadows of Men, is, I'm pretty sure it's the fifth. Is that right, Abir?
It is the fifth.
Good, I can count. That's a relief. The fifth in the Wyndham and Banerjee series. And I think wonderfully, and in a way unusually for some series, the characters continue to evolve and to develop, and the situation evolves and develops. So it's not just the same people in the same kind of spot, and I think that's really exciting. I won't say anything else except I'm really keen to see what happens in the next book over here, because you made.
So am I. I've written myself into the corner, and I don't know how I'm going to get out of it. But let's see.
Well, we're looking forward to it. I'll leave you now. I'll just show you a copy of the book in case, because neither the author nor the facilitator's got one. So I'll just wave my book about. Great cover as well, by the way. And I'll leave you to chat and come back in nearly an hour. Bye-bye for now.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Am I on? I'm Sulari Gentill, and it is my pleasure to come to you today from the lands of the Wiradjuri people. And I'd like to extend my respects to elders past, present and emerging before we begin. So it is my very great pleasure to be talking to Abir Mukherjee today. The distinguished gentleman on the other screen is the acclaimed historical crime writer Abir Mukherjee, as you might have guessed by the name of the event. He's an accountant by trade and burst onto the literary scene in 2014 with A Rising Man, which won the Telegraph Havel-Secker crime writing competition for unpublished would-be crime writers. A Rising Man was followed by A Necessary Evil, Smoke and Ashes, Death in the East, and the most recently, The Shadows of Men. In the course of these 5 books, the Wyndham and Banerjee series has been translated into 15 languages and won many awards, including the CWA Dagger for Best Historical Novel, the Prix du Pôle European, the Wilbur Smith Award for Adventure Writing, and the Amazon Publishing Readers Award for eBook of the Year. Abir has sold over 250,000 copies and is a Times bestseller. In addition to his prolific publishing schedule, Abir hosts a podcast, Red Hot Chili Writers, with fellow novelist Wasim Khan. Abir lives in West Scotland with his wife and 2 children, 2 of whom have COVID at the moment. So thank you very much for actually making it. Welcome, Abir, and thank you for joining us. This is the wonderful.
Thank you, Sulari. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And you're right. I'm coming to you live from my basement, which is where I am currently living. You can probably see my pajamas in the corner because half of my family is down with COVID, and I'm sort of being a single parent, looking after them and my wife. While hiding in my basement. But it's not all bad because I've got my whiskey down here and I've got my big telly, so I'm surviving. How are you? You have COVID yourself, don't you?
I have COVID.
Do you want me to put some soup or anything?
No. Look, I have been lucky with COVID. My son got very sick, but the rest of us seem to have a very mild form, which I put down to my superior genetic heritage.
That's what it is.
So it's all good. It's been lovely to have this to actually while away the hours. And in fact, I also listened to it on audiobook, which is a fantastic production.
Well, it's much better than the book. I'll tell you, the actors are really good. So.
Well, I always since my books went to audio, I always pick up the audio as well and try and see whether they did a good job. And your actors have done a wonderful job with The Shadows of Men.
Well, they're 2 fantastic actors. Simon Bubb, who's been Wyndham since the first book, but in this book we hear from Surendranath Banerjee for the first time, and we have an actor called Mikhail Sen, who was, I don't know if you had the BBC's adaptation of A Suitable Boy there yet that was made.
No, I haven't seen it, but I did Google him and have a look at what he's.
Yeah, he was one of the suitable boys in that. He's ridiculously handsome. So I like going for drinks with him because I so vicariously get people looking at us, and I'm like, yeah, I'm an actor. So, yeah.
Well, exactly. Well, you've got to use what you have.
That's right.
Look, I'm gonna actually go back to the very beginning for this interview. You were converted to crime fiction by Gorky Park, and while still at school. But it was a couple of decades before you left the respectable world of finance for that of crime writing. So I'm intrigued about you as an accountant.
I like the way you introduced me as an accountant. Half the audience have switched off already because of that. But
well, I'm wondering whether you were driven into writing because of some embezzlement scandal.
Well, that was the other thing I was going to say. You said, the good world of accounting, and it's not really. It's quite a messy financial world. But no, I always wanted to write. I did. I mean, even at school, I wanted to do an English degree, but 2 things happened. My English teacher sat me down, and in those days, because I was the only student in that class, I had 2 teachers because it was a high level of English. It was in Scotland you do hires and then you have 6th-year studies, but most people go to university after doing hires. If you want to go to university in England, you stay on and you do this extra year. So I was the only one who did English and had 2 teachers, and half of my lessons would take place down the pub across the road, which you can't do anymore. But in those days you could. And I remember being in the pub with one of my English teachers and him telling me, look, if you end up doing an English degree, you'll end up teaching snotty kids like yourself in a school somewhere. And between that and my father saying, oh, so you want to write? Very good, but first get proper job. So I decided to wait, and well, I didn't decide to wait. I decided to do economics, and then for my sins, I became an accountant, which I did for 20 years almost. And 2 things would happen whenever I got really, really tired of my job. I would do 2 things. I would buy a lottery ticket, and I would start writing a book. And neither of them got very far because my lottery numbers never came up. And when I was writing, I would always make the mistake of stopping after a couple of thousand words and reading what I'd written. And I would get scared. I would think, this is rubbish. Nobody wants to read this. Or life would just happen. You've got family or work or whatever. I would just run out of steam and I would put those words in a drawer. And so I reached the ripe old age of 39 and three quarters. And I thought, if I don't try now, I never will. I'll never do it. And I'd always wanted to, I'd always had this desire to write. And then a number of things all happened at once. I was watching breakfast TV. I was late for work one day, which shows you how interested I was in my job. And I saw Lee Child on breakfast TV, and he said how at the age of 39 or 40 he'd lost his job and he'd started writing. And I thought, that's a sign. It's a sign from God. Lee Child is telling me to write. So that was one thing. I never read any Lee Child. I went out and I picked up the first Jack Reacher book, and I read it in 2 days, which is odd for me because I'm a quite slow reader. But it was such a page turner. And the twist at the end was one of these. Why didn't I think of that moments? It was so simple yet so brilliant. There was that, and then the fact that it looked to me like it was really simply written. Now, it's only many years later that I realized you have to be extremely skillful
Yeah.
to make writing look that simple. But perversely at the time, it gave me confidence. I thought I can write a sentence like this. So that was the first thing that gave me a bit of confidence. And I'd gone out and I'd had this idea. For years, what had upset me when I was growing up was that, and I don't know what it's like in Australia, but when I was growing up in Scotland, we didn't learn about British colonial history. We learned more about German history and Italian history in the 1920s and 30s than we did about British history, especially, British history in what was then the empire and the colonies. And for me, as the son of Indian immigrants, my father looked at a map and said, what's the coldest, wettest place I can raise a family? So he moved from Calcutta to Glasgow. For me growing up, it was really a search for identity because I would go to school and I would learn something and I would come home and my dad would say, oh, it's very good. It's wrong. And then he would give me a completely different version of history. And maybe you had this as well. When you grow up
Yeah.
between cultures, you have this schizophrenia because you learn one side of a story, but you
Yeah.
come home and you learn a different side of the story. And sometimes one side is right, sometimes the other side is right. But what you learn from a very early age is that you cannot trust what you are
Mm.
told 100% by people in authority, be it teachers, the governments, hospitals, whatever. Which is why I think a lot of people don't understand why ethnic minority communities have such a reticence about talking to the police or even, getting vaccines, because in the past, our people have been experimented on. So
Yeah.
you tell these stories, and a lot of that filters through.
Mm.
And so you realize at an early age that there is this other side of the story that we don't talk about in this country. It was a terrible statistic that came out a while ago in a national newspaper, that 60% of people in Britain still think that the empire was a force for good in the world.
Mm.
And you think, okay, you are entitled to your opinion, but you do not know all of the other side of the coin. You don't know all of the things that were done in the name of empire, and of which we knew about because our parents would
Mm.
tell us about at least some of them.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to talk about that other side. But at the same time, I knew that the history taught in India is also romanticized. This freedom struggle, the way it's taught in India, you would think that every Indian was innocent and gullible and conned by these malevolent British people who acted as one. And if you've seen anything of Britain of the last couple of years, you would know that British people can't do anything in unison, other than organize a piss up at number 10. There's not much we can do in unison. So I always knew that the truth was in the middle, and I wanted to explore that truth. So I started writing. And this is a very long answer. I do apologize, Sulari. So I started writing. I had the idea. I'm going to send this British detective to India after the First World War, Sam Wyndham, and his partner Surendranath Banerjee came along at the same time. And Surendranath Banerjee, because he's working with British people, he's a young Indian officer, but obviously the British can't pronounce any names longer than one syllable. So he's known as Surrender Not. So the two of them set out on this case, and I wrote 5,000 words of it, and then I got scared again. I thought, oh my goodness, this is nonsense, and I put it in a drawer. And that would have
Yep.
been the end of it had it not been for me seeing this competition in the Telegraph, looking for new crime writers, and all they wanted was this first 5,000 words of a novel, which appealed to me because I was lazy and I'd already done the work, so I didn't have to do very much. I just had to tidy it up, and I wrote a two-page synopsis, and I sent it away. And then 3 months later, I got an email saying, "Congratulations, you've won. We're going to publish your novel." Except I didn't have a novel. I had these 5,000 words, and that was about it. And that was the beginning of it. And that became A Rising Man.
It is, and you rose to the occasion.
I would say I think there was another 2 years of a lot of bad writing, a lot of panicking, and a lot of good editing. So, yes.
But that initial book was written from the point of view of Sam Wyndham, right?
That's right. And the first four are written uh,
Well,
principally.
from the point of yeah. I thought that was the case, and I wondered because I know when I started writing in what is ostensibly, British colonial Australian white history. I also, I did occasionally have a prick of worry that someone who ostensibly looked like an immigrant would not be accepted writing white history or writing fiction in white history. So I wondered whether that's why you chose to go with Sam initially rather than Soren.
That's a really good question, and I've been asked the question before, but not from that angle. That didn't occur to me. What my problem was when I was starting out writing, I didn't feel confident enough that I could write respectfully and knowledgeably from the Indian's point of view, if you see what I mean. And maybe that's an issue for integration or whatever. But even though Surin and I share a cultural background, he's a young Bengali. I was an older Bengali, but Bengal being the part of India that my family's from and
Yeah.
his from, I still didn't feel culturally that I could do him justice at that point. I didn't feel confident in myself as a writer. I actually felt more confident writing from an Englishman's point of view, a white Englishman's point of view, than I did from a Bengali Indian's point of view in the 20s. And so it was more a matter of a lack of confidence on my part on being able to respectfully portray an Indian, if you were. So yeah, so it was more from a lack of skill than anything.
Okay.
Yeah,
You're more afraid of the Indian side.
yes, but the idea that I couldn't write a different point of view was not one that came up. As long as I did, there was nothing I felt confident. There was nothing that I couldn't write about an Englishman that a white British person couldn't write.
Right.
My character would be as realistic, whereas at the time I didn't feel I could draw an Indian character as well as an Indian writer could. And so if and we've all seen it. We've all seen lazy, stereotypical characters.
Yeah.
And, there's a very famous American book where there's a character who's described as the Hindu who comes on wearing a turban and he has a Sikh and he has a Muslim name, and you just think, why? And the character, just a tick box exercise. And whilst I would never do that, I didn't even want to take that chance of getting it wrong at that point. So so I went with the white Englishman's point of view.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm gonna ask the boring process questions first
Okay,
because I want to get back into.
I like boring questions.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about your process, how you actually write. I'm guessing that you're a plotter.
I am, but I'm the worst sort of plotter.
Well, I'm trying to imagine what your plots look like. Do they start out in red ink and are they in columns and then they turn to black ink when you resolve the crime, or what does an accountant's plot look like?
I was a really bad accountant as well, so my planning and plotting. I'm going to ask you the same question, by the way. When I've given you my answer, you're going to tell me how you plot. So for me, a book tends to start because they go. This is where my accounting training comes in. I know they come in chronological order. So the first one was 1919. The next one I knew had to be 1920. The third one is 1921. So the characters are aging in real time. And the way I start a novel is I will research the year of Indian history and see what happened. If there's anything that strikes me as being really interesting, I'll have that as the background to the novel. So, book three, Smoke and Ashes, is set against the beginning of Gandhi's freedom struggle. So, 1921, Gandhi calls essentially a national general strike, and the whole country goes on strike for a year. And there's a tremendous hardship, and it's a war of attrition. And in that atmosphere, the British send, Edward, Prince of Wales, who later becomes Edward the Eighth, who marries Mrs. And they send him to India on a goodwill tour. And he hated India. He didn't want to be there. He wanted to be in London with his mistress. So he arrives in Bombay in the middle of a riot, and he just shoots and golfs his way across India, and he arrives in Calcutta on Christmas Day. And I thought that's a brilliant backdrop. All of that, all of the tension, all of the strike, the fact that you have the prince coming. So that was my starting point for that book. And then the theme of the book, or the central plot of the book, tends to be something that will have caught my attention, or something that's annoying me, because my books are generally just therapy for me. It's because I'm Scottish, right? So I'm I'm a bit miserly. I'm not paying somebody else for therapy. I'm getting my so if there's something that's bothering me, that's what I write about. So book four, Death in the East, I wrote just after the Brexit referendum, and we had in Britain what we were seeing across the world: this rise in populism, this rise in ugliness. There was a fear of immigrants, a fear of foreigners, and it wasn't the Britain that I know, and it wasn't it's not Britain when Britain is at its best, which is open and tolerant. It wasn't the Britain that gave my father and mother the opportunities that they didn't have in their own country. So I wanted to write about that, which is very difficult when you've got a book set in 1920s India. But there was a parallel between what's happening now and what was happening 100 years ago, with the Jewish immigration to the UK, fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. So half of that novel is set in the East End of London. So I worked that into the plot. Now, to answer your plotting question, I tend to start with an outline, a two-page skeleton of what I think the beats of the book will be. And then I will probably sketch out the first third in a bit more detail. I'll probably do 4 or 5 pages on that, and then I'll start writing. I'll start writing the chapters, and when I get to about that third point, I'll flesh out the next third in a bit more detail, so I know. And quite often the characters have decided they're not going to do what I want anyway. So they'll be like, why are you still alive? You should be dead. I was supposed to kill you a couple of chapters ago. And so, but they work their way through. And then that final third, pulling everything together, again, I'll do a 4 or 5 pages, and then hopefully bring everything together and write that final third. So that's how I tend to write. I'd like to say that it works really smoothly, but it doesn't. It's a mess. I'm useless at plotting and writing. So tell me, how do you do it then, Sulari?
Well, I think I start like you do. I literally Google a year. So I write in the 30s rather than the 20s. So I'll Google 1933 and see what's happening around the world in 1933, see if any of that sort of inspires me to use that as the background or the scaffolding of the book. And I also have things I want to say, things I want to have conversations about. And they're usually contemporary things like with you, but there's always parallels in history. And history is a really good lens by which you can, or a method by which you can deliver a polemic without sounding preachy, because it's in the past, and people hopefully gather that you're talking about the present, but they don't need to be confronted by that. But then after that, I'm a pantser. I just sit down and start writing.
I like that.
And yeah, it's just,
I tried pantsing book 4, Death in the East, and it became a dog's dinner. It was just, oh, I had to go back to plotting. So I have tremendous respect for pantsers. I don't know how you do it, like writing without that safety net.
I think we're just chronically lazy and chronically optimistic that it'll all turn out in the end.
Well, I bear both of those curses, so I'm surprised I can't do it. I just lack the talent, I suppose. I've got the optimism and the laziness. It's the talent that I'm lacking to pants.
It's, there's always that point of fear, and those are your 5,000 words and so on. You just got to keep writing. just got to close your eyes and just keep writing, and eventually it'll
So
all
when I
balance,
do
I
this,
promise.
when I do this and it's a mess, I'm going to tell my editor it was Sulari's fault. I just
Yeah,
closed my
okay.
eyes.
Yeah, but when you discover this new way, I want credit. I want credit in that
Absolutely.
book. This book could not have been written if not for Sulari
They'll
Gentill.
have to be. Sulari will have to be in the book. That book, won't she? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's a useful name. It was probably around in India as well.
What does it mean?
My mother, well, it's actually Pali rather than Sanskrit. So my background is Sri Lankan. And I've never quite found out what it meant. My mother named me after a young girl, a 5-year-old, who gave evidence against her father and her mother-in-law and her grandmother in a murder case where the father and his mother killed the wife. So I think she was sort of hedging her bets.
Where your career was going. She knew you'd be a crime. Wow.
Well, I think it was a protection thing, If things go really bad, I have one child who testify.
The thought process behind that is amazing. I love that. But we have to find out what Sulari means. If anybody out there's listening knows what Sulari means or can Google it, please let us know. Please let Sulari know what her name means.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much. That's the quest. Okay, so back to you.
Yes.
All right, so we finished on the process. I want to talk about A Rising Man, just simply because that's where the journey began before we get to The Shadows of Me. So there's Banerjee and Wyndham. How did they appear to you? Like, did they apparate and they were there, or did you tease them out of the plot?
I have to be honest with you, and people don't believe me when I say this. I was in the gym, sitting in the jacuzzi, and they literally, because when I was at the gym, most of the time I spent in the jacuzzi, and they came to me. Sam came to me pretty quickly. Sam came to me as Sam Wyndham, and I knew who he was the minute he appeared. And Surin came literally within a minute after.
Okay.
In terms of who he was, and I think the reason is that really they're just two sides of me. Sam is my he's not just my British half. He's actually, although he's an Englishman, he's a Scot. He's a Glaswegian. His humour is very much gallows, Glasgow dry humour. He looks on always looks on the negative side of life. Although he is an optimist at heart, but he expects the worst, and that's a very Glaswegian thing. And he deals with it with humour. And Surin is more my naive, optimistic, younger Indian side, who's like questioning, the hypocrisies of the Western world. And you've probably have the same thing. You have these two voices in your head that are, always questioning the other side. You have
more than two. What do you mean two?
You have all these voices, but you have these, two voices in your head. Your Western side and your Indian cultural side, or your Asian cultural side, which are sometimes in conflict. A lot of the time they are in conflict, but sometimes they work in harmony, and that's beautiful. But really, these two characters, Sam and Surin, started out as just as manifestations of those two sides of my personality. I feel sorry for Surin because he's also got my Indian chicken legs, which is a bit unfortunate for him, and that's written into the first book as well. But yeah, so really they came together. They came very early. I would say for anybody who wants to write a book, ideas come in the sauna more than anywhere else. Uh, the steam room doesn't work for me; it's too hot. But the sauna, um, plot ideas come well for me in the sauna. Where do you get your ideas?
When I'm driving quite often, I get ideas. So I live in the country,
They're rhyming
so
never
we're
to get.
miles. No, because this is Australia. So, and I'm in country in Australia, so I have to drive 40 minutes to get milk.
Oh
So there's a
gosh.
lot of time behind the wheel, and you think best when you're doing something else that's mechanical. So
Yeah.
I'm a safe driver. I haven't driven into trucks while I was talking to Roland Sinclair, but it's yeah. So that's when they sort of kind of pop into my mind. I avoid gyms like the plague.
Yeah. You need one with a jacuzzi like me.
Yeah,
That's the key to
indeed,
it.
indeed. So when we look at A Rising Man, and we're starting with Sam Wyndham's point of view, and you have Suren coming in, and Suren is his subordinate, his sergeant. He is his softer, naiver, younger side. Um, but I did wonder, because it was written from the point of Sam in the fine tradition of Watson and Holmes. Does that mean that actually Sam is Suren's sidekick rather than the other way around?
There is a bit. Well, are they sidekicks? To me, they have got to equal billing. They've evolved. I'll be honest. When I started, I had no idea that Surin would evolve the way he did. I knew Sam would. Sam is a damaged man. He's come to Calcutta because it's slightly preferable to suicide. But India will save him. In his journey to redemption is India. For Surin, I didn't know how he was going to play out, but he seems to have matured faster than I expected. And I think part of that is because of what's been going on in the last 5, 6 years around the world, and there has been an awakening, at least in this country, about the fact that our history isn't all that's cracked up to be. Suddenly people are pulling statues down and people are seeing the other side of the coin. And so it felt right that Surin should take a more robust role in the time that he has. To be fair, he's been with Sam for 5 years now, and he's been living with an opium addict, right? So it's hard to put this guy on a pedestal when you live with him day in day out, and you
Yeah.
realise he's just bumbling through life like everyone else. Um, to be honest with you, Surin is the more intelligent of the two.
Mm.
He's the intellectual. He's the one that carries Sam a lot of the time. Um, but he's in this position where, by dint of the color of his skin,
Mm.
he will always be the subaltern. He'll always be the junior in that relationship. Um, and that, I think, is one of the curious things about this. How do you maintain friendship, this relationship, when one is hobbled and knows that they're
Yeah.
hobbled, and when they realize that, when that knowledge and that comes to them, at first he doesn't feel that, but as the books go on, he will feel that, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops.
It is. I mean, I can already see it just even in The Shadows of Men, the point at which he realizes that he is upholding a system that's oppressing him. And Suren suddenly becomes a much deeper character, and a much more grown-up character in a way. But Sam still maintains the position of romantic lead, I think, in The Shadows of Men. So are we going to be seeing Suren encroach on that?
Well, I've laid the groundwork for that in this book. I don't know how that's going to work. I can tell you that they're both going to be useless romantically. From Sam over 5 books. Sam's idea of romance is basically carrying out guerrilla warfare on whoever might like the person he likes, rather than doing anything himself. Because he's still on one level. He's got this guilt of his wife passing away in the influenza epidemic. And secondly, he's just reflective of British men in general, I think. So you have that, and Surin, comes from that other tribe of completely very romantic in their own
Mm.
heads, very useless sort of Bengali Indian men of that sort of upper middle class. And so I can't. There's going to be a lot of tears shed, I can believe. I don't know how much you know about Bengali literature, Sulari, but one of the big texts is this book called Devdas, which goes back a couple of hundred years and was a film made. And again, it's exactly that. It's this gormless upper caste Indian guy who falls for the wrong woman and then spends his whole life pining after her. And that seems to be the way romance works in Bengal. So, yeah, I don't fancy Suran's chances. Let's put it that way.
A lot of earnest looks across the room and
Yeah,
melancholy. Yep, yep. No,
really
I
bad. There'll be a lot of
very
really bad.
Bollywood. We can see that in the Bollywood version of The Shadows of Men when it's made.
God
Um,
forbid.
well, I was I have come to appreciate the genre a little bit more recently. When I was younger, it was always, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. But now, as I've
It's
as
evolved.
I age,
You know what? It's come a long way. But also in Bengal, we have another film industry called Tollywood, because it's centered on a place called Tollygunj, and that's very different. We're intellectuals, we're artists in Bengal,
oh,
so we have art films that go on for 3 hours, nobody understands, but come out going, art film, yes. So yeah,
random person on the bicycle riding through the set, that
right.
sort of thing.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to, at this stage, just invite audience members to be sending in their questions, because I should have said that earlier on, but I got carried away. And
Also, it's my fault.
towards the end of the
You
interview,
hear that, ladies and gentlemen?
yeah,
It was
it is
my
his
fault.
fault. Who can get a word in to ask anyone else to ask questions? So if you'll send in your questions, then there's in the last 15 minutes, I'll be able to put them directly to the man himself. So now we've sort of we're going to actually talk directly about The Shadows of Men instead of talking around it. But the trick is, I don't want to give away any spoilers, because there is just so much in this book. And I can imagine why you had to plot it, because there is just so much going on. And the real difference in this book, of course, is the point of view, the alternating point of view, which works beautifully. The voices are really distinct, and they are really reflective of each man. But I was wondering, was that difficult when you were writing, when you had to switch from writing Sam to writing Suren? Did you have to go and have a curry, or what did you do?
I would be even fatter than I am if I'd taken that approach. It's a good question. The toughest part of this, if we look at the writing process and the editing process. Well, before that, I should say that in each book I try and do something different. So by book 3, I felt I can write. Book 3 is the book that I'm happiest with. It's not the most complex of the books, but it's the one where I set out to write a thriller, Smoke and Ashes, and I feel I did it justice. Now, book 4, Death in the East, is a much more complicated book. It's got dual timelines. The themes of the books are much more complex. It's a better book, but I'm less happy with it because I didn't achieve what I wanted to. This book again is different because I'm pushing myself. For the first time, I have a different voice other than Sam's. And as you say, that's Suren's voice, and that was the hardest bit to get right. If we look at the editing process, a big chunk of that was making Suren's voice distinct and separate from Sam. So one of the issues we had in an early draft was that Suren's jokes were too much like Sam's jokes.
Yeah.
They had too much of the same sense of humor, and so all of that had to change. Suren had to become more earnest. He still has his own sense of humor, but it is different, and that for me was the hardest point of writing this book, which was getting inside Suren's head in the way that I had become accustomed to being inside Sam's head. And in some ways, it's easier because Suren sees the conflicts in his society. He sees them up front. whereas Sam is looking at them from the point of view of the Englishman, from
Yeah.
20,000 feet,
Yeah.
gliding serenely on. So in that sense, it was good to do. It was definitely the toughest part of this book was getting that voice right, was getting it distinct. I didn't have the curries. Maybe I should have. Um, but again, writing Surin was therapeutic. There are chapters there where Surin's, when he's in Bombay and he's thinking about Calcutta, and he has the Bengali, exiles' wistful longing for this,
Yeah.
mythical place of Bengal, which is very different to what it is in real life. But Bengalis, even those like me who are, one generation away, still see it in a certain romantic light, which when you land on the ground is nothing like that.
No.
I don't know
And
if that answered the question. Did that
yeah,
answer the
that
question?
did. That answered the question beautifully.
Good.
Because I did sort of, I remember this when I listened to it on audiobook, I tried to pick up whether I thought you were more comfortable with either voice, and I couldn't. So kudos
You
to you.
I was equally bad with both of them.
No,
Thank you.
they were both so completely natural, and you know what I really loved about it was that you didn't try to make them too different. So they're friends, of course they're going to have some similarities, and the easy way would have been to make them diametric opposites, but they weren't. They were obviously distinct human beings, but you could understand why they were friends and what they saw in each other.
Yeah,
So that
important. When you look at the history, you see these relationships between English people, British people, and Indians, and on the personal level, they were really quite profound. A lot of them. I mean, let's not forget one of Gandhi's closest friends was a white English pastor. Rabindranath Tagore, one of Bengal's greatest poets, the first non-white to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. One of his great friends was a Scottish architect, a man called Patrick Geddes. So you have these relationships there. You have these personal relationships between Indians and British people, and we don't make enough of them because I think that's where you see the truth. History's painted in broad strokes. If you want to see the detail, you've got to look at the human relationships, and that's why I think Sam and Surin are so interesting to me. I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, they're interesting.
Now, I've been warned that I've got 15 minutes to go, and I should be asking. I should be asking
How did
questions.
that happen? The clock's
Uh,
much faster in Australia.
And Selena, just if you can hear me, I can't see the questions that are
Shall
coming
I read
through.
out the questions? I've got the questions. Shall I
Have you
read
got the
them?
questions?
Yeah,
Yes,
I've got
please.
them. So here you go. You see, folks, I'm doing the work here, right? Just for reference. Ron
I'm
Dick
delegating.
Ron Dick says, Shashi Tharoor was a wake-up for me, re what empire did to India, with some analysis would show a similar Australian experience with British in the 19th and 20th centuries. Have you lived in India for any time to colour your book on Calcutta and Bombay? I must say that I thought Surin was the smarter one. Now, I'm going to answer a couple of those questions. I spent a lot of time in India, both as a child, also as an adult. I spent a lot of time in Bombay with work. So I do love the country. Now, I'm going to ask Sulari what you make of the Australian colonial experience. Is that different to what's taught here? What
Well,
was
no,
that like?
what was originally taught to us was a great colonial fiction of settlement. That the British came to Australia and it was empty, and and so they took it and civilized the emptiness. And of course that has changed, thankfully. And we are still, I think we're still grappling with the echoes of that great fallacy. But we're trying. We're trying very hard to change things and to try and erase that legacy, and the kind of indoctrination of generations that results. And I suppose that's the same thing from the other end. Britain is empire.
Absolutely, but the hardest thing is telling people facts about their past that they don't want to know. That's tough. It's
Yep.
tough to accept. if you've been taught one side of history your whole life, how do you suddenly accept that there's another one? In this country, for example, we're taught to revere Winston Churchill as this
Yeah.
great leader, which he was. At the same time, he's responsible for the starvation of 3 million Indians in the Bengal famine, which was a man-made famine. If not totally, then at least partially he was responsible. But he did it because he didn't think Indian lives had the same value as white lives. And which, if you think about it, there's a parallel there between the Nazis and the Jews. There is a
Yeah.
parallel. They obviously didn't think that, the Jews were as human as they were.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
the same way, Churchill did not think of Indians as being as human as white people, which is why he
Yeah.
allowed these people to starve. And when you tell that message, it's very difficult for people to understand here because it goes against everything they've been taught for 70
Yeah.
years. Some more questions. Sue Turnbull says, lovely interview, thank you both. Loving the shadows of men, and in particular the character of Urvis Cola. Where did she come from? I shall tell you. Well, Urvis Cola is actually a friend of mine
Oh,
who is she's a Parsi. She's actually from New Zealand. But she lives in Bombay and she is married to my friend Jahangir, who we meet in the book,
yeah. Yep.
and they are extraordinarily wealthy. They are from that segment of society where this gilded level. They have walkie-talkies to find their servants in the house. They'll scope their servants and go over at the end. It's that sort of. But they're wonderful people. And so I said to Urvis, I'm going to put you in a book. And she said, fine. And so that's where she comes from. And there is a lot of Urvis, my friend, in the character. But I am fascinated by the Parsi faith and the Parsi reception in India because they are this very small community, but they've done extremely well. And they've never been persecuted in the way that the Jews have been persecuted in Europe. And I think that says something about Indian society. So let's go on with some more questions. Is Sam going back to India to find Cecily Parsons? There's some chemistry there. Cecily's the woman he met at the racetrack, and Surin can be called back by Urvis or Miss Grant. I'll be honest, I don't know what's going to happen yet. I've got a contract to write the book and I haven't started it. And so who knows? Who knows what's going to happen?
A love
So
triangle.
well, gosh,
Sam and Suren can duke it out.
yeah, I can't see that happening. It'll be a love quadrilateral. Look, these two men live together like Morecambe and Wise. They don't share the same room, but the same premises. Kerry Little asks, was the early writing consigned to a drawer, Wyndham and Banerjee, or something else? It was a number of things. I've done chapters on things like I wanted to write the perfect heist novel, and I wrote a really bad 5,000 words of it, and realized it wasn't going to be the perfect heist novel. So it's been different things, but the 5,000 words that went into the drawer for Sam and Surin is what went into the competition. So I've had lots, I said about 5 or 6 false starts over the years on different things, but the first thing I ever handed or showed to anybody was the 5,000 on Sam and Surin. Kate Evans says, great collection of whiskey you're showing us there. It's true. You know what? I had to move. I'm a terrible writer. I've had to get rid of my books to make space for my whiskey on my shelves in my basement. As well as Surin's voice. How much did it stretch your historical imagination to write from his perspective? As I've said, I think it's been quite tough writing from his perspective. Did you need to look for different details? By the way, I do like Surin's urbanity and keep waiting for him to surprise us, and Sam even more with who he is. It's been a joy writing Surin. It's been different and it's been difficult, but it's been good fun. I don't know how it's going to be tougher writing him than it will be writing Sam, simply because the culture is it's more intricate, it's more complex, and I don't have a feel for it in the same way that I do for British culture. But it'll be fun. Let's see where we get to on that.
Can I just throw one in? When your Indian family reads any of your books, and particularly The Shadows of Men. What did they think of Soren? Do you get particular comments?
Not about, well, when the first book came out, a couple of them were thought that I would make Surin a figure of fun.
Okay.
Uh, and I said, no, well, that's not the case. That's not what I want to do. It's not. It's not. And that stemmed from their view of how British people consider Indians. And again, it's not a realistic view, but it's a view based in the way British people historically saw Indians, especially Bengalis. You know, Bengalis are you know, well, we like to think of ourselves as the intellectuals of India, but we're not. The reason that Bengalis tend to be, well, the fact is that Bengal was the first part of India that the British settled in. So Western education was visited upon upper caste Bengalis before it was on anyone else, which meant that when it came to administration of the country, you know, the civil service was populated, you know, in large part by Bengalis. But it also meant that the Bengalis were the first people to use British law against the British. So, and that upset the British. They had a great respect for people like the Punjabis or the Afghans, you know, these what they called the martial races, like the Gurkhas, whereas they looked down upon people like the Bengalis, and they thought it terribly underhand to use our laws against us. You know, it's not playing cricket. You know, you should know your place. And so the Bengalis were looked on as you know, and what's his name? Kipling wrote a poem called "What Happened," about an uppity Bengali lawyer called Harish Chandra Mukherjee, who petitions the High Court to say that Indians should have weapons, you know, in the same way that the British can carry weapons. And obviously he won the case because he knew the law, but that allowed the Afghans to come down and chop Harish Chandra Mukherjee up. So, you know your place, said Kipling to the Bengalis. So, yeah, I don't know why I'm ranting about Kipling now, but anyway, that's how we're seen.
Well, while you're talking about Mukherjees, I've got to ask, I haven't asked yet, Prashant Mukherjee. Is he a friend of yours, a relative? Why did you kill him?
I just love the idea of, because I've killed so many of my friends in books. So at the back of most of my books, I have in the acknowledgements, I apologize for the number of my friends that I've killed or abused in some way in the books. But most of them want to be, you know, victims. Yeah, and I don't understand why. But so in this one, I just thought I want to have a character who's not very nice, who's me, and you know, just so I can use the line, Mukherjee was a prize ass. So which I just thought was a nice touch. I got an email from a woman a couple of weeks ago saying to me, "I love your books, but I don't understand why you're so mean to accountants. In all your books, you're making fun of accountants. And my best friend is an accountant. Obviously, you've had a really bad experience with an accountant. What happened?" And I said, "I have to tell you, it's the opposite. It's a joke at the expense of myself and my friends." And she was very surprised at that, but she liked that a lot.
Oh. So have we gone through all the?
Oh no, there's one more question. Well, there's a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Deborah Nixon asks, "Is Sam's addiction a way of reducing him to a status that enables a relationship with Banerjee? Sam is no Pukka Sahib, but I find it hard to imagine to create a tone that is not racist in the colonial 20s, where I thought of the awkwardness and the impossibility of friendships between British and Indian as portrayed by Foster." I would say, as I've just commented on, I think there were relationships between these parties. I think Foster didn't see it because he wasn't privy to them. But, you know, there were, as you rightly say, Deborah, the majority of the stories that we have are about the British being sitting on their, you know, on their pedestal and not consorting with the Indians. But that wasn't always the case. For me, the quintessential book of empire is Burmese Days by George Orwell, where you see the fact that so many British people went out there, sold this lie of superiority, which I think in Australia was probably the case as well. You were sold this lie of civilization, etc. When the people got out there, when the British got out there, so many of them realized that it was a fiction. They were upholding a lie. And that's why you had so many gin-soaked memsahibs and so many upset colonial officials. Because it's difficult as a moral Christian people. How do you justify the oppression of another race unless you believe that you're doing it in their interests? And when you realize you're not doing it in their interests, what does that do to you psychologically? And I think that was a big issue with empire, and we don't really look at that. So we only have the facade of empire of we were there, we were civilizing, as people like Foster have put in. In terms of Sam and Surin, Sam is damaged. He has to be damaged when he arrives in India. I see Sam as that first generation of modern men who've had their eyes opened by the First World War. And the Anzacs saw the same thing. They were led by people who they'd always believed were their superiors, and they were massacred. And so they had their eyes open that these British upper class people, not everything they tell you is gospel truth. So he arrives in India much more open than he would have had he not gone through the First World War. He's more willing to see Surin as a human being as opposed to a subordinate, because he knows that his natural reaction now is to kick out against authority, because authority is what's led his life to nothing. And I suppose that's why they're able to have this relationship. Sam no longer believes everything he's told. He's still prejudiced. He still has, 25, 30 years of prejudice on his back. And that comes through in the novels as well, but he's more open than the archetypal British colonial officer.
It's interesting. I always, I thought through the novel that Sam held Suren closer to his heart than Suren held Sam.
I think yeah, I think if you look at in the first book or the first couple of books, it's the other way around. Sam has Surin has Sam on a pedestal, and it's when he's sort of cleaning up after him, when Sam shambles in from an opium den at 3 a.m. or whatever, that Surin's like beginning to question what he's doing. But there you are. That's life, isn't it? That's life.
I'm going to jump in a minute. We're at 7 o'clock, so
sorry.
I've got to get the kids to school.
Yeah. But look, that was so enlightening, and you described very much what I was talking about, which is that the characters have developed and different sides of them come out. And there's a fantastic part in The Shadows of Men when you talk about the First World War and all that stuff about the general saying, "You can die, but I'm staying here, mate." And Sam is traumatized by that for very good reasons. It's fantastic. Look, I can't recommend these books too much. I would start with the first one, because I think then you actually see what we've been talking about that development and the movement, and you just learn a lot more somehow. Anyway, I think you should just read them in whatever order, but preferably start at the first one and end up with 5. And we're waiting for 6. So I'm really looking forward to that. So if you don't yet have your own copy of The Shadows of Men or any of the books, go to Booktopia or go anywhere to any good bookshop and buy them immediately. And you can also get Sulari's books, so you can see what she was talking about, and you can think, oh, okay, plotter, pantser, interesting. There's so many parallels. I think it's been fantastic. Very quickly, I'd like to invite people watching to listen to our podcast. We have a Bad Sydney podcast, and we have a Facebook page all about crime, where all our family of crime lovers to come together and talk about what they love. Our next monthly event is Dinuka Mackenzie talking about The Torrent, which is I love it when a book's won a prize before it's published, a bit like you really, Abir. You'd won the prize before you'd written the book. I think she might have written more of the book than you, to be absolutely honest, but I'm not sure. But that should be excellent as well. Look, I know that everybody will have enjoyed the evening as much as I have. We'd better let you go tend to your COVID or your children. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Sulari, for a wonderful conversation.
Oh, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming or beaming in.